So my name is David Ruderman, and I'm speaking English, and I hope all of you understand me. Josh will, of course. First, I have to know whether we're communicating. You know, it's I came from America, so I apologize. I don't know Spanish. You know, I really admire the fact that you know English and so many other languages. But you know, we Americans are very limited. We are usually monolingual, and we get away with it because everybody speaks English. So I can come to Spain. I was very reluctant, and Javier encouraged me. I said, I can't speak Spanish. How am I going to communicate with you? But he said, you'll understand me. So far you understand me? Yes? Now see, I not only speak English, I speak New York English. Where are you from, Josh?
New York.
So I speak, when I get excited, I speak fast. So now I'm speaking slow, but I will get fast. So what I would want to ask you is, if you are losing me, if I'm speaking too quickly, go like this, all right? And say, slow down, or even ask me a question. I've been doing a lot of teaching in Europe, mostly in Germany and in the Low Countries. And students, and I was just in Budapest, I taught. Students are very shy, and unlike Americans who interrupt every minute, they never say anything, and I don't like shy students. So please, if you're used to sitting and listening to the professor and thinking he's important, I'm an American, I'm not that important, and I want you to interrupt me. So ask a question, interrupt me. If something is not clear, don't let me go on. I can stop. I have a lot of ground I want to cover in this course, but it's not so important. I want to be understood. And I want to give you something, but I can't know exactly what I'm giving unless you give me feedback. So I hope we will get to know each other in the course of these 4 sessions, and there are actually 5 if you want to come to my special lecture, which is on the 21st, which is about a book that I'm writing here. I see I'm doing more than just teaching you. I'm sitting and writing a book and getting to know Madrid. But I hope you'll come to that as well. To learn something from me. So far, everybody understands what I say. Now, let me just, I want to meet who you are. So I have your names. I have 8 names here. Josh is not on that list. But why don't you just tell me, Carmen, are you here? This is Carmen, all right. You're the expert on Toledo, right?
Yes.
All right, nice to meet you. And now I have a Javier Vega Bayo. I'm not going to...
Javier is not here.
Is not here today?
Not yet.
Okay, all right, okay. See, my first problem, first I have to know how to pronounce your name. Miguel is right here, okay. I have a little bit about you, so I won't ask right now, but I hope to get to know you from San Diego de Compostela, all right? And Ana is right here, okay. All the way from Portugal you came? Oh my God. Have you ever met the American ambassador in Lisbon?
No.
He's an American Jew. The reason I know him is because his son was a fellow at our center. I don't know if he is anymore, but I was, anyway, I've never, that's wonderful you came, I hope it's worth it, you came all this way. And Pablo.
Pablo cannot be here today.
Cannot be here today. And Sonia.
This is me.
Sonia, nice to meet you. Okay, Middle East you study. And Tomas Garcia, that's you, very nice to meet you. Is Francesco Javier is not here today?
No.
Okay, and I met the 2 of you. Anybody else I haven't met? What's your name?
I'm Blanca. Blanca Villuendas.
And you're going to be in the course.
I don't know yet.
She will see.
You're checking me out. If I'm not good, you'll drop me. See, that's the American way. What we have in America in the first day of class is shopping. Do you have shopping here? So I remember when I taught at Yale for many years, so I would have like 100 people the first day. And then the next day there were 5 left. I mean, they were shopping 6, they would stay for 1 minute, go check another course, and then they would, and they wouldn't even give me a chance to show, whether I'm worth it or not. Anyway, so you check me out. That's what we. All right. You're shopping. Okay. So I'm not going to commit myself to learning your name until you decide you want to. All right. Okay. So here's what I want to do. This is a course that I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. First of all, just a word about myself. Forgive me for talking about myself, but Javier could have given me an introduction, but I just want to introduce myself. I study Jewish history in the early modern period. I did my doctorate in Jerusalem at the Universidad. I also happen to be a Reform rabbi. No such thing in Madrid. But I have a Reform rabbinical degree. My father was a Reform rabbi. My daughter is married to a Reform rabbi. It was why I did it. I have no idea. I think it was because to stay out of the draft. This was during the Vietnamese War, so I entered rabbinical school. But anyway, it was part of my education to learn Hebrew and Jewish texts, and then I went on and did my doctorate. I've been teaching for 40 years. I began my career at the University of Maryland, which is a big state university outside of Washington, D.C. I then founded a large program in Jewish studies at Yale University. I was there for 11 years. And then finally, the University of Pennsylvania recruited me to create a very special program. Javier and Katya were both on this program called the Cat Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, where we bring every year 20 scholars from around the world to study a topic in Jewish studies. It's a kind of Jewish think tank. And it is an amazing place with a lot of energy and a lot of excitement. And I've been directing that center for 19 years. Next year will be my last year as the director at the center. Through my experience of meeting so many scholars coming to the center, I became more and more excited by coming to Europe. So I have done this a lot. I've been in many European universities, wherever I can get away with English. And that, of course, is expanding. And I love to teach, but I also love to connect scholars with each other. And that's why really I'm here. I mean, I have to get away from my center to write anything for myself. I'm there, I'm serving other scholars, but here I just serve myself. But nevertheless, to connect to Madrid, you are my connection. In other words, I'm meeting you, and that is really an important part of my being here. So this course was a course that emerged over the years to teach my graduate students. I've had about 18 students who have finished their PhD with me in Jewish history. Over the years, I developed a course where they had to read a certain amount of material to prepare for their comprehensive examinations. Over the years, I developed certain themes and certain ways of presenting the material. So I would meet with graduate students every week for a whole semester, and sometimes even 2 semesters, and we would talk about this material. And the way that we would do it is I would give them an enormous amount to read every week, and each student would then present the reading, and we would discuss it, and so on. After about 10 years of this, I began to put down my thoughts on paper, and I created a book, which I think you have received, some of you, right? And if you sign up for the course, you get a free PDF of the book. The book came out in 2010, and it is called, I think, an exaggerated title, Early Modern Jewry and New Cultural History. And it is an attempt to understand a specific period in Jewish history, its cultural characteristics, its understanding of itself, and to argue that this particular period is not medieval and it is not modern. It has its unique characteristics, which for a better name we will call early modernity. Now, that, as you will see, the term early modern is problematic for a variety of reasons. In fact, when historians in general speak about early modernity, it is still very ambiguous and problematic a period. In other words, what I'm doing essentially in this 4-lecture course is an exercise in periodization. So, I mean, let's start with the very most basic thing. periodization is essentially historians artificially constructing units of the past to better understand them. In other words, if I say that the early modern period begins in 1500 and ends in 1800, I don't mean that literally. I don't mean that in 1499 I'm still a medieval, and when I become in 1500 I'm all of a sudden an early modern. Undergraduate students might take this so seriously to think that we actually have a medieval period or an ancient period. And of course we don't. So therefore these are artificial constructions by historians to provide some kind of meaning for a period. Now up to now, why do historians periodize in the first place? Well, I mean, to understand the past, many historians would prefer to work on specific individuals, movements, ideas, problems, microhistories. But there comes a certain point where you need to interpret the past in a more grand scale. In order to comprehend something about the past, you need to organize it in some kind of form or shape. Therefore, periods. But there's another problem with the period, the issue of periodization. Periodization, we can go back and trace the history of periodization within Western civilization. We can also trace it in Jewish civilization. When do Jews begin to periodize? Any idea? By the way, if I ask a question, you can answer it. You don't have to. I'll answer my own question if you don't answer. But do Jews have a form of periodization?
In the Bible, no?
Yes?
In the Bible?
So we have the biblical period. What else? What happens after the biblical period?
No, I mean in the Bible you have.
In the Bible itself, different periods. So yes, we have the Torah, and we have the early kings, and we have, yes, there is a kind of historical development of periods in the Bible, but I'm speaking about Jewish history over 2,000 years.
The Jews was expelled from Palestine.
Okay, all right, so that's a very important point, exactly. So first in 586 before Christ, the first expulsion. The second expulsion in 70 AD or CE, right? And then we have a diaspora Jewry, okay? Now one way of understanding this from the point of view of the rabbis is we have a Torah shebichtav, a written law, and we also have a Torah sheba'al peh, a oral law. In other words, the rabbinic writings that were written as commentaries, as elaborations on the written law. And we have a period, we could say, of later rabbinic writings. In other words, within rabbinic writings, we have Rishonim and Achronim. These are Hebrew words, and I translate all the Hebrew. Anybody of you know Hebrew? Some of you know Hebrew, right? A little bit? No? The first rabbis and the later rabbis. So, in other words, there is a sense, from the point of view of the culture of the rabbis, of periodization. In other words, there are different periods. First there is the Torah itself, the Tanakh, the Bible, and then there is the post-biblical, right? The first rabbis, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the rabbis of the first period of rabbinic writings, and then the rabbis of the Talmud, and then the rabbis who are the Rishonim, the early rabbis of the medieval period, and then the later rabbis, and so on. So everything is from the perspective of the text. That's one form of periodization. Periodizing, going back to periodization in Western culture, the problem arises when you talk about the early modern period. What if you're talking about the world and not just about Europe or Spain? Do Muslims, for example, have a medieval period or an early modern period? What does early modern mean for a Muslim? Well, you have Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, right? So is that the early modern period? Do Muslims see themselves as early modern? Or expand it even broader? What about world culture? Indian, Korean, Chinese? Is there such a thing as a world early modern period? And these are what world historians especially have struggled with. So you see, the problem of these early periodizations, medieval, early modern, modern, and so on, is that they're primarily constructions of European history. The question is, so in other words, what we have here is a kind of form of Orientalism. We want to see now the whole world through a European prism. So what I'm saying is that be very careful about historians who periodize, because periodization is only a tool and it should not be seen as the God's divine truth. In other words, and therefore, when I suggest what is the early modern period for Jews, it is only a hypothesis. It is only a historical construction. It does not have, you should not walk out of here and say, now I know what the early modern period is. Because I'm not sure I know is myself. All right. So given these limitations, and I was telling you about my graduate course, I wrote down an attempt to periodize. The book has been very well reviewed. I have some negative reviews. And historians have already criticized me about certain ways of seeing the past. And that's good. I mean, I invited these criticisms, and I see this book as not the final word, but only the beginning word. So what I want to try to do with you in these 4 sessions, it's 10 of 12, and we'll figure out whether we need a break or not. I'm going to give you a 5-minute break, so I'm going to go for about 15 minutes more, because I'm just getting started now. When I get started, I can't stop, so you'll see. But if you need a break, we will break. But by the way, you were all understanding me? Easy, right? English, good? Yeah? All right. You got my English? New York, right?
Yeah, I'm doing all right.
What?
I'm doing okay.
You're doing okay, all right, okay. All right, so what I want to propose is the following. First of all, let me begin with my proposal, and then I'm going to speak about challenges. And the challenges I'm going to deal with the rest of this 2-hour session. The first session, as you see from my syllabus, and I hope you've read it, is basically historiographical. I want to present what I'm doing against a body of scholarship of historians who have written on this period. Both general historians, but also Jewish historians. So that's what I'm going to do. And I want to talk about the problems of interpreting this period. But first of all, let me give you, in a nutshell, my proposal for explaining this period. I want to argue that there are 5 themes, 5 characteristics that allow us to speak about the Jewish community of early modern Europe. And when I say the Jewish community, I am speaking about something that is trans-regional and transnational, that connects the continent primarily of Europe, but not exclusively Europe. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at 5 communities simultaneously. And here is the uniqueness of my approach, because most historians deal only with one of these areas, not with 5 together. The 5 areas are, number 1, the Sephardic Diaspora. In other words, after 1492, after the Jews are expelled, they go to Italy, Livorno and Pisa. They go to the rest of Italy. They go to the Ottoman Empire. And then later on, the conversos in Spain also leave by the end of the 16th and 17th century. And they go to Amsterdam and to Hamburg and to the rest of Europe. And to Italy. Again, Livorno and Pisa are primarily converso communities and not simply Jewish communities. In other words, what we're speaking about here is both the Eastern Sephardic Diaspora, which is the Ottoman Empire, and the Western Sephardic Diaspora, which is primarily the Netherlands, Amsterdam, but also Hamburg and other places where the conversos go. And of course, eventually, the New World, right? New Amsterdam, New York, Curacao, and so on and so forth. So we're speaking, therefore, about an important Sephardic part of our course, but it is essentially those who leave Iberia, who leave Hispania. Now, so that's one community. A second community is what had been the Holy Roman Empire, namely Central Europe, Germany, the area of German-speaking areas, in Central Europe primarily, which would include from Frankfurt in the west to Prague in the east. A third community would be Italy, Italia, and the Italian Jewish communities, so that would be a third area to look at. A fourth area is Eastern Europe, and this is a new community created during the early modern period, Poland, Lithuania. And the last community community which takes us out of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, which includes, of course, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Now, I could have included also North Africa, I could have included France, I could have included England. For a variety of reasons, I don't. The North African community is the most glaring missing, and primarily because it's very hard for me to understand it in the terms that I'm describing it. The scholarship on this area is not fully developed yet, and also it is very hard to speak about an early modern Morocco or Algeria. I don't know what that means exactly. And I don't know these communities well enough. So I'm speaking about 5 communities. Others, hopefully, will expand my vision beyond these communities. But that covers the overwhelming majority of Jews living in this period, okay? Now, here are the 5 characteristics that I want to suggest apply more or less to all 5 Jewish communities. Number 1, and I'm going to just sketch them because the rest of our course is going to be about talking about these 5 characteristics. Number 1, mobility. I just came from California 2 weeks ago where I spoke at a panel of the Renaissance Society of America on mobility across Europe, and I was one of the panelists speaking about Jewish mobility, what I call Jews on the move, Jews moving. Jews, you know, le juif errant, you know, the image of the, how do you say that in Spanish? I can't pronounce it. Anyway, you said it.
Errante.
Say it?
With many R's.
Many R's.
Many R's.
All right, okay.
That's the point, the tricky point.
So Jews are always on the move, right? You see how I move around from country to country. But what I want to argue in this case, in the early modern period, and I'm not going to give you dates now, but let's say roughly for the purposes of our analysis, 1492 to 1782. Why 1782? I'll tell you later on, but at the end of the 18th century, that's good enough, all right? That's the period we're talking about now. Mobility is a constant factor. Expulsions. Spanish expulsion. 1492, 1497 from Portugal. Later expulsions from, for example, the Papal States, 1569. Local expulsions throughout Germany and so on. Expulsions that continue right up throughout the 16th and even 17th century. But then you have, and a movement of Jews eastward. In other words, moving to Italy, moving to the Ottoman Empire on the part of the Sephardim, and Jews living in Germany moving eastward into Poland, Lithuania. But then you have reverse mobility. After Khmelnytsky, 1648, of the pogroms in Poland, Lithuania, a large movement of Jews back into Western Europe. So by the 17th century, there is now a movement of Ashkenazic Jews, Jews who are not from the area of the Mediterranean, moving back into Central Europe and ultimately coming to Amsterdam. Amsterdam had been founded by Sephardim, but by the 17th and 18th century, they are invaded by Ashkenazim. And the Sephardim don't like them. They don't get along at all. They hate each other. They won't marry them. They won't talk to them. They'll give them menial labor. But nevertheless, and we'll talk about this, but you see all of a sudden there are clashes. One of the results of mobility is that Jews are meeting other Jews. Of course, Jews in the Middle Ages also traveled. They didn't stop traveling at any period of time. But in this period of time, because of good boat travel, better travel by horse and so on, the possibility of connecting, of people moving, it wasn't just Jews who are moving, all kinds of people are moving. People are leaving the countryside and going to the city. Refugee, itinerant scholars moving from university to university. This is a period of great mobility, and Jews are very much a part of this mobility. And what mobility creates is social mixing. So, for example, have you been to Venice? You must go to Venice, it's so close, right? No, you've never been to Venice? So in Venice, there are lots of synagogues, right? I was just in Prague. Prague has a whole bunch of synagogues as well, right? It's now called the Jewish Museum. So why are there so many synagogues? Because there are different kinds of Jews. So Venice is a good example of social mixing. You have Tedeschi Jews, Ashkenazic Jews coming from the north. You have Ponentini Jews. You have, what's the other one? Levantini Jews, so Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire, and Jews coming from Western Sephardic Diaspora. And you're having all of these different communities that are sometimes getting along with each other and sometimes not. Javier tells me that in Madrid, this is a perfect community. There's only one community. There's no sub-communities. But that's not the way it is typically for Jews. You know, you have 2 Jews, you have 3 synagogues. Why a 3rd synagogue? Because you can always say, that's where I'm davening. Or I'm not there because I'm in the other synagogue. So you need always an extra synagogue to say you were there when you weren't there. In any case, what is going on here is, I think, one of the most interesting characteristics of this mobility is the creation of encounters between Jews. Forget about Jews meeting non-Jews, that's obvious, and learning languages and interacting with non-Jews, but Jews are also meeting other Jews. And you will see how prominent a feature of that is in telling the story about early modernity. So the first characteristic of my course is to talk about mobility. Characteristic number 2. You're following my outline?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to go 10 more minutes before I give you a break. I want to finish this part. And Paul will probably want to get out of here by then, I'm guessing. But he doesn't have to, but just in case. Characteristic number 2 is communal cohesion. What I mean by that, if you compare this period with the modern period in Jewish history, the characteristic of modernity would be the breakdown of the Jewish community. In other words, when all Jews become citizens of the state in France, in England, in Spain, everywhere, essentially the governments don't want to have strong communities with political power. They want to diminish that power. They want individuals to be Jews, but not to have powerful communal structures that interfere with being a citizen of France or Germany or elsewhere. In the early modern period, it is in the interest of mercantile governments to have strong Jewish communities, to collect taxes, to supervise the Jewish community, and thus what emerges in the early modern period, almost universally, are the creation of strong Jewish communities. In Italy, particularly during the period of the ghetto, and we'll speak about the ghetto. In the Sephardic Diaspora, in Livorno, in Amsterdam, strong communities of individuals called the Ma'amad in Amsterdam. In Germany, a relatively weak Jewish community, but nevertheless a structure created by the state. In Eastern Europe, the most powerful Jewish communities ever in the history of the diaspora, called in Hebrew the Va'ad Arba Atzot, or the Council of 4 Lands. A kind of super community, a kind of government within a government. Jews are so powerful, they run their own institution throughout the entire area of Poland and Lithuania. And in the Ottoman Empire, a strong Jewish community that exists even though it has no official recognition, but nevertheless, the Ottoman government sort of ignores them, so they create their own strong, powerful structures. So what you have in the early modern period is the appearance of strong Jewish communities. However, they are increasingly run by laity, the laitization of the Jewish community. That is the Hebrew word balei batim. That is businessmen, rich Jews, powerful political figures, as opposed to rabbis. Rabbis are still there, and rabbis are still powerful, and rabbis are still doing their thing. But more and more, rabbis are becoming employees of Jewish organizations run by rich businessmen. Now you could say that to some extent this exists also in the medieval period, in the modern period, of course. Nothing is totally unique. But I'm suggesting here a process of the diminution of rabbinic authority. And I'm going to show it on many planes, but I'm going to argue here that while rabbis are still an important part of this period, vitally important. I mean, the great cultural figures of this era are rabbis. Nevertheless, they are finding that their total authority, if it ever existed, I mean, that's a good question, is now being eclipsed by other forces. So, for example, to give you an example of Eastern Europe, the Vadar Batzot is a secular lay body. The rabbis who are a part of it are employees of the Vaad. They are not the leaders of the community. The community are run by very rich, powerful Jewish interests. Something like your bosses on J1, right? And they control the Jewish community. Or something, I mean, I don't know how the Jewish community of Spain runs, but the Jewish community of America is run by a federation. My daughter happens to be a big executive in the federation, so I know all about where the power lies. This is a lay body. It's not run by rabbis at all. Rabbis have very little power in America. What?
Not here.
Nor here. All right. So my argument is that it begins in this period. So strong Jewish communities plus laicization. That's number 2. Okay. Characteristic theme number 3 of this course. Okay. The first was mobility. The second was Jewish communal cohesion. Number 3. This is a big topic, and this will be my topic of 2 weeks. Knowledge explosion. What I mean by this is, number 1, the printing press, and the creation of new technologies to transform the way Jews transmit their tradition. It means the Hebrew printing press. It means Jews reading in foreign languages. It means the creation of 2 Jewish languages, promoted and enhanced by the printing press. Number 1, Yiddish. Number 2, Ladino. Ladino is later, of course, but of course Judeo-Espanol emerges as soon as the Jews leave Spain, and they come to the Ottoman Empire where they speak Spanish. And later on it is called Ladino. And there are Ladino printing books, and hundreds, thousands of books, and newspapers and so on, and a whole renaissance. The same thing for Yiddish. Take the picture of the Yiddish book dealer going to Amsterdam to publish his books and then go bring them back to Eastern Europe. Amsterdam was a center of Yiddish publication. You know what else was a center of Yiddish publication? Venice. You would not think that Italiano and Yiddish go together. But the Tedeschi Jews, the Jews who had come down, founded a major printing press of Yiddish in Venice in the 16th century. So Hebrew was being published. And not only that, the books that were printed by Christians. The great printing press of the 16th century is the printing press of Daniel Bomberg in Venice, who publishes the first rabbinic Bible and the first Talmud. Christians are publishing Jewish books. Christians are reading Hebrew and Jewish books. In other words, the printing press is an enormous part of our story. But the other part of our story is also, for the first time, Jews are entering the university. Yes, there are all kinds of medieval encounters between Jews. Montpellier, for example, supposedly had Jews who founded the university. I would be very skeptical about all of that. I think Jews enter the university as official students only in the 16th century, and the first place is Padua. Padua is the first nominal Catholic university to open its doors to Jews. Jews study medicine. In the course of the 16th and 17th century, Jews are studying in Italian universities. They're also, conversos, of course, are studying in the great universities of Spain. What emerges is a population of Jewish doctors, physicians, a community of Jewish doctors all across the continent who are connected with each other. Scientific societies are very much a part of early modern Europe in terms of the scientific culture. Jews do not have that nor are a part of it. But they are connected in terms of their relationship to universities. And what emerges is a kind of Jewish medical community within the 16th and the 17th century. In some respects, it goes parallel to the converso community. In some respects, the conversos are even connected to the other Jews who are graduates of the university. But clearly, therefore, the university and the printing press are two components of a new knowledge explosion. I want to explore this as a major factor in our story. Particularly, and here now we are not only speaking about the movement of people, mobility, but also the mobility of books. Books break down barriers. Books break down regional cultures. So for example, the best example that I will give you is how the books published in Italy and in the Ottoman Empire reach Eastern Europe, and how Jews who are relatively insulated from the outside world are reading about books, about ideas that they never read before. And vice versa, books from Eastern Europe eventually will come down into Italy and elsewhere and stimulate a conversation. So the third characteristic is knowledge explosion. Let me finish the last two and I will stop for a minute, or for 2 or 3 minutes. Number four, I want to use the word crisis. Crisis is a problematic term because, you know, Jews are always in crisis, right? They always have a crisis. It's a very Jewish word. And if you overuse the word, it doesn't mean anything. But what I want to suggest is that there is a crisis to authority. And I want to use the word because it is also an early modern word. Early modern historians refer to a crisis in the 17th century as well. Economic, political, whatever it is. And now we have, I was just in Mercedes' office, and very prominently displayed in her office is Jonathan Israel's book, Radical Revolution. Jonathan Israel speaks about a crisis, a radical crisis around Spinoza. Spinoza is a part of our story, right? Coming from Converso Jewish Amsterdam. But I want to speak about a different crisis, the crisis of Shabtai Tzvi, a messianic figure who appears in the 1660s, and who around him a movement emerges, a movement of followers who want to break the law. Some of them convert to Islam, later on they convert to Christianity, and they create a crisis for the rabbis and for traditional Jewish life. I want to explore this crisis and see it as a vital part of our story, not only for one region, but for the entire area. And finally, my fifth characteristic, if you're still with me, is related to the fourth characteristic. It is a continuation of the crisis. I want to use the word mingled identities. If you prefer the word hybridities, which is a kind of post-colonial overused term, you can use that term as well, but I don't. Mingled identities, or to use the term of Natalie Zeman Davis, braided identities. I like that. Anybody have braids? You know, braided identity? You know, all mixed up. You know, sort of mingled identities. In other words, what I want to suggest now is that for the first time, certain groups within the Jewish community. In fact, when I came here for the first time to Madrid, remember for that conference, that's what I spoke about. I spoke about mingled identities in early modern Europe. I was writing that chapter at the time. Yeah, that was what, about 4 or 5 years ago. 5 years ago. So mingled identities includes conversos. When a converso returns to Judaism in Amsterdam, does he really give up his Christian background? Can a convert really, truly remove what had been a part of his previous self?
Just a quick question.
Yes, please, please.
The returning to Judaism, is it like any other conversion, like with the baptism and everything else? How is this return?
All right, that's a big question. So the answer, I'm going to give you a quick answer now, and we'll come back to the question later on. Yes, in fact, there were also, in some cases, circumcisions, Brit Milah. There was a process but this had to be created out of nothing, ex nihilo, because when the Jewish community started, it didn't even have rabbis. It had to import rabbis from Venice, from the Sephardic community of Venice. So what we're speaking about is really the creation of the mechanisms of conversion, of how to invite Jews back into the fold. But what happens is that many don't go through this process. This is what I mean by mingled identities. In other words, they're sort of betwixt and between. They're sort of, yeah, we're Jewish, but we're not Jewish. In other words, what we have here is a definition of Jewish identity which is not defined by the church nor by the rabbis. It's what I say I am. I am Jewish. I feel Jewish. I eat Jewish. You know what a Jew who eats Jewish is? It's a gastronomic Jew. Or a Jew who feels Jewish. That's a cardiac Jew. And there are several more, but I can't remember them now. In any case, defining one's identity on the basis of one's own understanding of oneself is a characteristic of the early modern period. Conversos are one group. Converts to Christianity, individual converts in Germany and in England, are a parallel group. A third group are Sabbateans, followers of Shabtai Tzvi, who, as you will see, get all mixed up. They convert to Islam, they convert to Christianity. Who are they? What is their identity? There's a mixture of everything else. And I want to argue another group is also maybe mingle identities. And this is the Christian Hebraist. One of the most interesting aspects of this world are Christians that love Judaism. They don't necessarily love Jews, but they love Judaism. They love Jewish books. They love Jewish wisdom. They feel closer to Jesus Christ when they read Hebrew books. When they read the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, they think they're discovering true Christianity. And in some respects, and so at what point can you become closer to Judaism without becoming Jewish? What I'm going to argue is that Christian Hebraists, even though they don't become Jewish in a formal sense, they don't go through this conversion that you were asking about, but nevertheless, they become labeled as Judaizers. Others are very suspicious of them. What are these Christians hanging around Judaism so much, publishing Jewish books, reading Hebrew? What's going on here? Why do they need this? I mean, this is the wonderful ambiguity of Christian-Jewish relations. Christians hate Jews, but they love Jews. I mean, or they love Judaism. They need Jews in order to define themselves. They need Judaism to understand their own Christianity. And thus you have this very interesting intermingling. And some of the same converts that I'm speaking about also find that when they enter the Christian world, they can make a living by becoming experts on Judaism because they know how to read Hebrew, they know Jewish sources. So many of the early university professors are former converts, are teaching Hebraicism as originally Jews. It's a very confusing, so we have competition between Christian Hebraists and converts for being the experts of Judaism to the non-Jewish world. So what I would argue that these 5 characteristics, do you remember them now? Mobility, communal cohesion and laicization, knowledge explosion, crisis of Shabtai Tzvi, mingle identities, may help us explain the early modern period. Now already other historians have argued with me that there are other characteristics that I've missed. Where are women? I mean, I have to be politically correct here. Where are women? For example, gender. I could talk about that. I will talk about that. Recently, a book has appeared by Roni Reinstein about the Kabbalah and early modernity, arguing that the Kabbalah transforms this world. I'm not so sure. I think his book has problems, and I think Kabbalah, I've mentioned already in several instances, might fit into the other categories I've described. We could argue about adding categories. There is also the category of religious behavior, that essentially the experience of Jews is not only about intellectual things. You might argue that my characterization of the early modern period is very intellectual. It's very high elitist. Though the social historians have argued with me saying I haven't really spent much time talking about common Jews and common human beings. I like people that have ideas. I guess I admit that's my sins. I love people with ideas. So we could argue about these 5 characteristics. And we could also argue that they don't fit every area at the same time. Particularly the Eastern European historians will argue that what's going on there is a different dynamic altogether. But I want to consider, nevertheless, early modernity through these characteristics. and present some of its strengths of analysis and also its weaknesses. So, did you understand me? Too fast? It's okay? You're all with me? Are you quitting or staying? I'm putting you on your spot. This young woman here that I don't know her name yet.
Blanca, no, I don't know yet. Yeah.
You don't know. Okay, I'm not putting you on the spot. I said, I'm trying, you know. I'm trying to sell myself. You see, I want you to stay, but I don't know.
It's very interesting when
You have to go, I
I do.
All right, thank you for
Sorry
sitting for an
about
hour.
that.
Okay, all right, we will talk.
Sorry, I gotta go. But
All right,
I enjoyed
okay.
it very much.
Thank you, okay.
Excellent.
All right, so do you have to go to the bathroom or something? You want to stop for a minute? Paul, you want to go?
Busy,
Yeah.
busy.
All right, okay. So let's stop for 5 minutes, okay? And then we'll continue. All right. So it's okay, Carmen? Non-Jewish world. But there's a difference between Amsterdam and Italy, in that Italian Jews more openly embraced non-Jewish culture, and Spanish Jews living in and Portuguese Jews living in Amsterdam were more conservative, were more timid. Of course, knew the non-Jewish world intimately, but nevertheless, you couldn't argue that they had necessarily liberal attitudes towards that world. They were very conservative. They were very fearful of the authorities. They wanted to sort of play by the rules. So there was a different cultural dynamic between Italian Jews and their openness to the larger culture and Dutch Jews. I think there are similarities, of course, but there are also some very interesting differences. So Kaplan's contribution, I'm not going to say much more about him, but I'm going to really move on really quickly because I only have 8 minutes left, is another very important historian of this period. Let me mention 2 other historians who deal with Eastern European Jewish history. Both of them are Americans. One of them lives in Israel. His name is Moshe Rossman, R-O-S-M-A-N. And the other is Gershon Hundert, H-U-N-D-E-R-T, who teaches at McGill University. Both of them were trained in a period when Eastern European Jewish scholarship, remember the majority of Jews in the modern world live in Eastern Europe, up until 1939, when so many of them were, of course, destroyed in the Holocaust. What we're speaking, therefore, is the largest Jewish community that grew so natural birth rate unbelievably by the 19th and the 20th century. Russia ultimately takes over this whole region, which had been Poland, Lithuania. The Partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century are a critical moment in the history of this world process. Hundert and Rossman are 2 primary historians of this culture. Hundert has written a book on the Jews of Poland in the 18th century. It is a very important book. Oh, you're going to write these names now. Thank you. Gershon Hundert. And that's what I should be doing. He's a better teacher than I am. But I didn't even know we had. All right, I'll get up now. Moshe Rossman, and why don't you write Kaplan and or I can write it. Kaplan and Bonfield that we talked about. Hundert has argued really against me, although he was one of the readers of my book, which is very interesting, that essentially the majority of Jews in early modern Europe lived in Eastern Europe, certainly by the 18th century. And that it's very nice to talk about dynamic interactions in Amsterdam and in Italy and elsewhere. But the majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe. They lived in a world where to be a non-Jew was not such a great thing. What he calls, there was no beckoning bourgeoisie. That's the phrase that he uses. In other words, the romance of living in the non-Jewish world was not attractive. Who'd you have? Essentially Polish peasants, drunk Polish peasants. I'm being very crude here, but I'm in Spain, I'm not in Poland. If I'm in Poland, I'd be careful the way I would phrase this. But essentially, what's so exciting about Polish culture? In other words, essentially these Jews lived in an autonomous space. They saw themselves as being superior. They lived within their own cultural parameters, essentially rabbinic cultural parameters. They lived by the 19th century in what was called the Pale of Settlement. And therefore, they couldn't care less about what was going on in the non-Jewish world. They were indifferent to that world. And therefore, to speak about mingle identities, Jewish cultural interactions, and so on, no. They were living within their own space. And therefore, what is modernity? Modernity is something that is primarily Eastern European, and it means basically the continuation of traditional Jewish values in society right up through the 19th and even early 20th century. And therefore, even though new ideas come from the West, basically Jews are living in their own isolated space. Now, I'm not going to attack Hunter. I don't agree totally with this presentation, but I'm trying to just explain how he understands this history. For him, therefore, nothing is important other than Eastern European Jewish history. And Eastern European Jewish history has its own dynamic, its own understanding of itself. And therefore, when you talk about Jews in Amsterdam or Jews in Italy, you're talking about small percentages of the early modern European community. The Jews of Eastern Europe were not affected in the same way. Now, Rossman, on the other hand, doesn't agree fully. He argues that very much by the nature of Jewish life, wherever Jews live, they live under the same sun as everybody else. And they absorb patterns from the larger culture. So Rossman wants to argue that essentially Jews living in Poland and Lithuania were Poles. Many of them even spoke Polish eventually, but they lived, their beliefs, their ideas, their cultural habits, their economic practices reflected the larger culture that they lived within. Moreover, as you will see when we talk about the printing press, we talk about the mobility of Jews coming to Eastern Europe. These Jews were not isolated totally. Moreover, there is movement. After 1648, during this very serious pogrom of the Cossacks, the Khmelnytsky pogrom, large numbers of these Jews go west, they go south, they go to the land of Israel. Look at Safed in the 17th and 18th century, or Jerusalem in the 17th and 18th century. They are made up of Sephardic Jews, yes, who spoke Ladino, but they're also Ashkenazic Jews who came from Poland, Lithuania. And they sometimes clash. So what we have here are multicultural zones. Prague is a multicultural zone of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Krakow has Sephardic Jews in it. Hamburg is an Ashkenazic Jewish community with a large Sephardic population. And of course, Amsterdam by the 17th century. Soon the Ashkenazim are so important in Amsterdam that they take over. They become the majority. It becomes the Yiddish capital of the world, right? Or a Yiddish capital of the world. I'm exaggerating. So essentially, is Hundert's notion of isolation truly correct? In any case, Rossman, you should read Rossman and Hundert together because they present a kind of different approach. Okay? Both of them focus on Eastern Europe and see this as the center, but nevertheless, they see the world of early modern Europe differently from the perspective of this large, isolated community which has now become so important and so independent, but also cut off to a certain extent from the activities of the West. But not completely cut off, that's my point. The other interesting thing, which in Hundert book, Hundert deals with culture, he talks about Kabbalah and so on and so forth. But one of the great places where the Sabbatian movement goes is Eastern Europe, right? So if they're so cut off, we have a man by the name of Jacob Frank, who in the 18th century presents himself as the embodiment, the incarnation of Shabtai Tzvi, and argues that Jews need to convert to Christianity. It is a strange, bizarre movement. Recently, we have a wonderful, wonderful book, and if you can spell his name, you could write his name on the board. Pavel Mancheko, I can't spell it. A book on the Frankism, on the Frankists. So, indeed, is that a world where Judaism and Christianity is not mingling? But that's Eastern Europe now we're talking about. So, in other words, is Hundert's view totally correct? So we have Hundert and we have Rossman. And it's 1:30. Do I have to stop, or can I go for two or three more minutes? Is that okay for you, 2 or 3 more minutes? I just want to, I didn't completely finish. I'm trying to think who I could leave in, right. All right, I want to mention two other historians We will talk about their work later on, but they are important because I argue with them. One is Shmuel Feiner, F-E-I-N-E-R, and I can do a little work here too. And the other, he writes better than I do though. Feiner, and the other is Sorkin. David Sorkin. Sorkin is an historian at the City University in New York. Feiner is a professor at Bar-Ilan University. Both of them write about the Enlightenment period, the Haskalah in Hebrew. But both of them have argued, especially Feiner in recent days, that there was a cultural renaissance for Jews long before the actual Enlightenment itself at the end of the 18th century. And they have introduced such words as an early Enlightenment, an early Jewish Enlightenment, in describing activities of Jews in the 18th century. For Feiner and for Sorkin, the Enlightenment was a radical break and was the beginning of modernity for Jews. And for Feiner, in a book which I unfortunately published, I won't say unfortunately, I published the beginning of secularization. And you know, we have so many books now written on secularization and what it means, and it's a very complicated notion, the notion of secularization. But Feiner makes it very simple and argues that by the 18th century, Jews are being secularized throughout all of Europe. Feiner's work is quite vast. He's written a book called The Jewish Enlightenment. Actually, we published in my own series 2 of his books, and this work on secularization. And they are quite important in describing this period. But they describe a radical modernity, a break from the past, and a lack of appreciation of the early modern precedent. Part of my writing this book is a response to Feiner. So that's why I want to mention him. Sorkin also has a similar notion. Sorkin has written about the Jewish Enlightenment and Moses Mendelssohn, particularly in the context of a religious enlightenment, and he has compared him to Catholic and Protestant versions of this religious enlightenment as well. And he has several books that are important in this regard. Now, so to summarize, and we're going to finish. Jewish historians have added a tremendous amount. I only gave you a sampling. There's so many more people I could have talked about. But I want to show you that I wasn't writing here in a vacuum, that I was drawing upon all of their work, and that many of their insights are extremely important, whether we're talking about Kaplan in Amsterdam, Bonfil in Italy, Feiner and Sorkin, or Rossman and Hundred for Eastern Europe. All of them have made important contributions, which essentially what I'm trying to do is to link them together in conversation with each other. I mean, that's really what has not happened totally yet. But these contributions show you the vastness, the excitement of this period for historians in the last 20, 25 years. This has become an extraordinarily fruitful area of scholarship in the history of Judaism and the history of Jews. So that's my historiographical introduction, very quick. I wonder whether how much you got out of this and so on, and whether me lecturing is adequate, but I'm doing the best I can. We now turn to these 5 factors next week. If you want to read something, you're welcome. If you don't want to read something, I don't care. I mean, I do care. I'd love to have you read. But I suggested how you might go about, the more you read, the more you'll understand me. And we'll continue next week. Okay?
Just,
Yeah.
may I make one comment or
Absolutely.
one
Sure.
question?
Yes.
Not because I'm interested, but I think that may be of interest for Spanish or Iberian students.
Go.
Most of the elements of these innovations you have mentioned, you may also already observe among Portuguese and Castilian Jewry in the 15th century, at least in the second half of the 15th century. Minguellos, mobility, crisis of authority, communal cohesion, mingled identities, and also the question when you mentioned the establishment or the beginning of confraternities. You already have confraternities starting in the early 14th century in Iran, for instance.
Yes.
And we have the
Yes.
institutes of these
Yes.
confraternities. And
Yes.
they are all everywhere in Castile in the 15th century. So I think that you whip out the Iberian Peninsula from your book or from your view of early modernity. So the question is, did you take the decision because of a chronological question? Because let's say that you are starting
With the expulsion.
I mean, I don't want you to ask for the beginnings of your period, because I mean, I already remember when Marc Goff, the French historian, he was talking about how some historians, they always ask about the beginnings of something, and this is not the interesting thing. I mean, so the question is, for instance, you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture Jonathan Israel, and his title, he starts by 1550, that has to do with papal politics, new policies towards Jews. I mean, a radical change in the traditional position of the church. And already the first half of the 15th century is a vacuum, because
He's
after
not
the
interested.
expulsion of the
Yeah.
Iberian Peninsula and southern
Yeah.
France, so let's say that he starts in the mid-16th century. So would you start at the same period, or why do you take, or what would we make with these Iberian communities, late medieval, because I don't think that they are less interesting or less important for the early modern period than Italian. I mean, and when you mention for the Western communities, both Bonfil, Kaplan, everyone is talking about his own field.
Yes.
So I'm already
You're talking about your field.
my
Yeah.
own field, but
Okay.
I have always the problem. What is 15th century is the late Middle Ages, in early modernity. Most of the phenomena we already have in that period. In the Iberian
All right.
Peninsula.
I don't know how to. I mean, this involves a long conversation. I think this is very very fruitful.
Maybe also interesting for students.
Yeah. No, I want to come back to this. I don't know if we can go on, because
next week.
it's 20 up. But I've been very much influenced by the notion of the 15th century, of a bare approach to the 15th century, which is a period of decline, of inquisition, of limpieza de sangre, of essentially seeing this as the preview of things that are getting worse and worse, leading ultimately to expulsion. Now that kind of maybe that's a teleology that's wrong. In part, what's his name? Frank Talmadge, and later on, who was the Tel Aviv historian who was written against? Goodworth has argued against this approach. I think part of it is a function of my lack of knowledge of the Spanish Renaissance as opposed to the Italian, and essentially looking at these trends as they emerge. On the other hand, you could also, and I've sat in audiences where medievalists have raised their hand and said, well, all these 5 factors existed throughout the Middle Ages. You know, I mean, Ibn Ezra was running around all over England and he, you know, essentially. So there's nothing new under the sun, ain't kol chadash. I think we have to be more precise. I mean, I threw out a lot of different things here. I think, you know, mobility is, of course, a new factor. The printing press is obviously a factor that comes after. Well, I mean, how important is it at the end of the 15th century?
It's very important.
You're right. There are all these incunabula coming out of Portugal and Spain. Yeah. So again, I mean, that's great. The problem of what he's illustrated is the problem of periodization is a problem. I mean, you can't. There's no way I'm going to fit all my material at a certain date.
No, I mean, I don't want to discuss or to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Yes? Because we have a Spanish or a Nigerian audience. I think
it's absolutely relevant.
To
Yeah.
take that into account.
So maybe we need to start. We need to start earlier. You know, when would you start? 1412? I don't know. Would you start in 1391? I mean, yeah.
1450.
1450. Yeah.
Because I would like to know more about this. The idea I have of the Portuguese judía is the ghettos is not so prolific in terms of this ambience of Venice.
It's not exactly a ghetto. The Juderia is not exactly a ghetto.
No, but
They were close.
That could be one of the questions. You have ghettos in Castile after 1480. Closed ghetto. That Jews can only go out during the day, not.
All right, so that's the same, yeah, that's interesting.
And this is a policy for the whole country.
All right. No, I have to live to learn more.
In Spain, it worked in.
And concerning Portugal, I think that Maria José Tavares has an article that is going to be published very soon that deals with, among other issues, with that topic. How Jews in the 50s and in the 60s in Portugal, more on a local basis, there is no national policy like in Castile or in Aragon in the 1480s.
So what you're saying is that my categories may be right, but they start earlier in Castile and Aragon. In other words, one needs to look before the expulsion
The
period.
question of confraternities. I don't think that you find confraternities anywhere else in the Middle Ages.
Well, remember that was,
Outside of Spain,
yeah.
That's, I don't know.
Yeah. No, you're right. Spain is the first, and then they appear in Italy. The first is in Ferrara at the beginning of the 16th century. And then they go to Eastern Europe and so on. And that's certainly a part of the new Jewish communal structures that emerge. So again, we're going to find precedents that go all the way back. This is so. The answer is tzarich iyun. I mean, I think his comment is really well taken. I just learned something from this. I'm really very appreciative. But we have to rethink of this earlier period. In other words, it's not just the medieval period that has certain characteristics that are similar to early modern, but that specifically this community in Iberia seems to display, I don't know, precociously, is that the word? Some of the characteristics that I've described for the later
The
period.
idea of citizenship of Jews you already have in the 15th century instead.
All right.
And, but let's stop here. We can continue.
I have also a question to Professor.
What?
We are now.
She came all the way from Portugal from this. You got to give her a minute more.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We are now finding in former judíos structures of stone that are not precisely or not completely studied, that are connected to supposedly an Aaron, a crypto-Jewish Aaron Kodesh. I don't know if it appears also here or if there is.
When is this from? From the
already
16th
from
century?
the Inquisition,
The
after
Inquisition
the
period.
In
Inquisition
the 16th
period.
century, I think
Yeah.
there is a
Yes.
case in Porto.
Yeah.
Not just
No?
one, it seems now that
okay.
there are two more in Porto and in other places.
You found an Aaron Kodesh.
Well, it's.
That's what they say, the
Yes.
archaeologists, but I don't know to what extent
This
they
is the
know.
problem. We
really.
don't have an exhaustive study on this, and it's not typical. Or I don't know if in Spain also this happened. No.
This particular Portugal is.
I think I better let you go, but this is fascinating.
We have.
We have more to talk about, and I hope you continue to offer me your arguments. I love it. I hope you're with me, or to the extent you can be. Please come again, and we continue next week. Then on Tuesday, not Wednesday.
Tuesday, yeah.
Wednesday is a local holiday here.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Tuesday next week,
So
and then.
next week is Tuesday, the class.
And then the week after, we have two
We have
different
two,
two sessions.
yeah.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So is this Spanish? This is German.
German.
That's German, right? Yeah.
Central European
Okay, all right.
also.